Hello, this is the seventh episode now in this series, and I wanted to talk today a little more about the conversation that I had with the Catholic priest. Um, so, so I went to the church and I had presented essentially the questions that I had to this priest ahead of time, um, via email, and we sort of discussed them a little bit. Um, Together. So, first, I just wanted to read off the messages that I sent, and then we can talk about what was said during this meeting a little more. Okay, so let's open this. Okay, Nicholas. Okay, right. So, my questions, I really wanted to keep this contained and to ask like two pointed, directed questions. So I asked two questions and I said, why doesn't God give worshippers a clear physical sign to demonstrate his existence and presence? As, for example, he did with Gideon with the wet slash dry cloth. And then I said, most people experience a class of experiences which we can call religious experiences. During such experiences, individuals usually have a profound and overwhelming sense of meaning, coupled with a feeling of connection and to something higher than them. I'm struggling, though, to decide whether these experiences, feelings, are telling you something true about the external world, like a sense of balance, or whether they are only generated from your own mind, like dreams. What are your thoughts on this subject, and why does God reveal himself to people in this way and not in a more straightforward way? So he said, to the first question, he said, I'd suggest with God has given, I suggest that God has given clear physical signs, even if he made them more obvious. However, people are still capable of refusing belief. We have a lot of difficulty getting ordinary and even very intelligent people to believe non-religious things all the time, even when the evidence for them is overwhelming. John 9, the story of the blind man, of the man born blind, is a good test case for this. If you read the whole chapter, I think it's easy on a psychological level to imagine this having happened. Furthermore, God does work through the efforts and teachings of human beings because human beings by nature live in societies. So God dignifies not just individuals, but human societies and human social structures. I'm thinking about Peter's dialogue in Acts 10:41 to 43, where Peter admits that Christ did not appear after he rose from dead to everyone, but only to those with whom he had eaten and drank. It's important not just that Christ be believed, but that he believed through human witnesses. My sense is that Christ's resurrection, coupled with the martyrdom of those who claim to have seen him after he rose from the dead, is sufficient warrant for belief. There's more to this than can be typed out quickly, but hopefully this helps. And then to the second question, he says, the questions the question of these experiences is to ask both what their ultimate origin is and whether they point to something true. I'd hesitate labeling the vast majority of these experiences as probative experience for the veracity of what someone believes after experiencing them. But God can give someone an experience that leads that person to truth, and that experience is helpful for that person. God brought the experience about, and that experience led the person to what is true. That God ultimately brings about an experience does not mean that it is not generated through normal physical conditions. For example, however, it would, in the vast majority of cases, be wrong to say that these experiences prove the truth of the faith. What is believed by faith cannot be proven, or something about that person's spiritual life. Someone can feel close to God, which might not be, or even that they constitute evidence for anyone other than that person. But none of this means that such experience was not willed by God, nor that it did not lead someone to believe something true about God or about one's relationship with Him. Hence, it's more important to ask whether what this experience is that the person experiencing it to believe is true or not. So then I respond with the following email. So the first point I say, you're right, of course, that people can differ in what they consider clear physical proof, and that people can react differently to evidence based on their biases, etc. So let me narrow the argument to just myself. Here's a simple, controlled experiment, which I would consider sufficient to establish God's existence and presence beyond a reasonable doubt. I call it the shoebox experiment, and this is how it goes. I procure a shoebox and proceed to examine it carefully to make sure that it is completely empty. Then I close the lid and ask God to place a certain object, a snow globe, a quarter, etc., in the shoebox in some period of time, say 30 minutes. This should all be done privately, without telling anyone else, to avoid having the trick of the century played on you. Then I would patiently sit carefully and observe the shoebox for that period of time to make sure it is not tampered with. After the time has elapsed, I open the shoebox and look inside. If the item I asked for is indeed in the shoebox, I'd win. No, I would consider that completely conclusive. Why wouldn't God provide me with that sort of evidence? Why is it important that Jesus be believed through witnesses? I would much rather have first-hand experience. And then I say to the second question, I say, yes, of course, you're right in what you say. If the experience leads you to truth, then the experience is helpful. But suppose one does not know whether the destination to which one is being led is true or not. For example, an individual sees a starry night sky, listens to music, engages in intense physical activity, all common triggers for these kinds of experiences. And then they experience an overwhelming sense of meaning and a feeling of connectedness with something much larger. Usually such experiences are also accompanied by other positive feelings of love, well-being, I hate that word, or ecstasy. Now suppose this individual, after climbing down the spiritual heights, reflects back on this experience and asks, but is there actually a higher power? Then, ultimately, what matters is the veracity of the experience, since the conclusion is in doubt. If the experience is completely internally generated like dreaming, then I wouldn't trust the conclusion. But if the experience is in response to some external reality, like fear, then I would trust the conclusion more. It all depends on the status of the experience. And then, essentially, after that, he says that we should talk more in person because, like it's a lot to want to communicate via email back and forth. Um, so that's pretty much it. Um, so now let's talk about what it was like the actual meeting. So I got there and the guy was very nice. We went to this like private room. Oh, excuse me. It's a little early right now, and apparently my body wants to be sleeping. But so we went to like a private room together, and we started talking about things. Um, the first, he was kind of asking some questions about me, first of all, personal questions and stuff like that. And he essentially just reiterated the point that he said um that ultimately, of course, um, well, the first thing was that he was saying that God has essentially free will and that he can choose whatever he would prefer, like there's no reason why he has to reveal himself to people. And I told him that I agree, that the whole argument actually hinges um, on the fact that God it hinges on the idea that God wills to reveal himself to people. If God didn't, then there wouldn't be an argument, you know. Um, but the question is, if God does want to reveal himself, why not reveal himself in this way? So that's that was kind of a first point. And then he mentioned that one of the reasons why God might not want to reveal himself in that way is that, like here, like this sort of shoebox experience, you're putting God to the test. So I told him, why not put God to the test? Like, what's wrong about God submitting to a test? And he was essentially saying um, that it was wrong because it's like you have the upper hand on God, you have the authority over God, and God doesn't have to do anything for you. Like you're not like the boss that can tell God, oh, appear here, don't appear here, and like negotiate with him. Like I will behave, I won't behave this way unless you do this for me. Like, know that God can't be negotiated with like that. And and yeah, and I essentially just said, no, yeah, I agree that, in terms of authority, that a person can't force God to do anything. But m- people can still argue with God and know that God is unfair or unjust in his actions. So, like I told him the example of Job. So, Job actually explicitly says that, of course, he can't tell God what to do, um, but that God was being unjust in his actions. Uh, so that was sort of similar to my argument. Not so much that God has to do this, but I feel like it's unjust for God not to do this. And so he essentially talked about, why do you think it's like unjust? And essentially, because the reason I gave is that the reasons to believe for God and the claims of Christianity, I guess, are insufficient for me. And so I talked about like different faiths. There are a lot of different belief systems in the world. And, he went through and kind of, um, he said that you can go through and kind of eliminate a lot of the world religions. Um, and he went through that a little bit. But then I told him that there's also seems to be issues with Christianity, like, and I gave him just two examples. So I gave him the example of, that Jesus predicted that the end of the world was coming in the lives of the generation that was listening to him, and obviously it didn't come about, and that was a big problem for believers as well. Like in the apostolic writings, right after Jesus's death, and uh, and so that was the first point, and then I also talked about the Exodus, and like how come there isn't any proof of it, like on the Egyptian side, any recordings of events that were like pretty dramatic, like the entire Nile turning into blood, like for 3 days, no light on the habitations of the Egyptians. It was just engulfed in darkness. Like, how come, that this didn't occur? Um, so and he was honest and he really tried to engage with these questions, but ultimately I think like he essentially said that there are these questions that can't be easily like answered, and he said that these questions are worth looking into. um but he sort of made an attempt to answer the questions, but I didn't really think it was particularly um if it particularly good attempt, and then he was just like, like even if you were like an archaeologist and a biblical scholar, whatever, there will always be those questions. The Bible is a big book, and um there are always these questions and stuff. um and he encouraged me to continue to answer, and he said that just because, even after you have faith, like, no, you can't you won't resolve all these questions. and you can continue to struggle with these questions even if you do have faith. And then let's see what happened. Um, so after that point, um, he essentially just said that, oh, I feel like you are, suspended. You're like you can't decide because he said that faith will require um um the a move of the or I forget exactly what he said, but it's like assent of the intellect with something of the will. So I told him like no, he said it requires the acceptance of the intellect with the assent of the will. So I told him, okay, but that assent of the will, like, I feel like it might bias you. It might color the way. So, like, people are good at seeing patterns even when they're not there. And if you have a certain idea of the world, like, if you do have an assent of your will towards a particular position, then you become biased and you can begin to see things that aren't there. And I really don't want to do that. And he's like, oh, well, everyone has bias. Um, but But, it's essentially your decision. You have to decide faith or no faith. And and so yeah. And then we were talking a little more about that and like how people believe. He's like, "Oh, you're a clever guy," which is why um for you, you know how to prove something, really prove it and not prove it. When something's really proven and when something's not proven. And so for you, it's this is uh this is difficult. Like this is a big issue because like you don't have enough data to be able to say for sure, but that it's ultimately a matter of faith. So, and then we talk a little bit. I tell him that I always had the suspicion that most people who are technically believers don't actually believe. Because if you imagine, if they really did believe, like that all what they believe is literally true, then their actions would be very different than they are. For example, you'd never see any believer be late for liturgy, for example, if they really did believe. Um, and I told them that I really don't want to be like that. I want to be either real believer or real unbeliever and to know the actual truth. And yeah, and then we actually got almost at the very end, in the last like 3 minutes of the conversation, we got to the actual core where, like he was saying, where he was saying that merit. So he mentioned that there's like some merit to belief. And so I was like, okay, what is that? Why is there merit to believing something? Because ultimately, I feel like that is the actual answer to the question. Like, why does God not reveal himself, like to people in the more direct way? It must be that there's merit to people using faith to get to that point rather than to have like legitimate proof. Um, so he said essentially that the merit of belief is that it's an act of love. So, like, it's sort of like an act of love to believe someone when there is insufficient evidence, I guess, or something along those lines. And that's where the conversation ended. And to be honest, that last part really moved me. Like the idea that belief is an act of love. Um, the issue is that I feel like that's a dangerous thing, because you can also be led to, yeah, you can also be led to um, you can also be led to all sorts of wrong conclusions, and you can fall into any traps if you choose not to use your head as the ultimate guide, but to use trust or love of some entity. And he acknowledged that as well. Oh, so I guess it all just depends on. And I mean, I do get it. I do get it. Like, you have experiences of, say, God, and I do understand that that's maybe part of love in a way that there isn't like physical manifestations of this experience. But but I guess it's the issue is that it's the experience itself. I'm not sure whether there even is God or not. So, and the experiences I have of God are very, very shadowy. So how can you love an entity when when you haven't established its existence? Well, anyways, but that's essentially what our conversation was. I'll think more about that answer, but it did move me. It did move me for sure. And so yeah, I'll think more deeply about this question today, and then go from there. But yeah, well, I do think. I mean, that sounded right. It did move me in a profound way, I think. All right. Okay. Anyways, it's very early here, so I better get back to bed. But that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.